Hi, this is PG of PG's Lumacy. In this tutorial, we will be making the stable for the Rainbow Loom Nativity Series. Make sure to set up your loom in the rectangle configuration, which means that the pins are aligned. And the color that we will use for this project will be the caramel color from the Rainbow Loom original line of solid colors. There will be 4 individual pieces that we will be making for this project. 2 posts, a beam, and the roof for the stable. Let us start by making the first post. We will be using double bands for this, and we will place them on the first row. And then we will repeat this pattern all the way to the bottom of the rainbow loom. You may want to pause the video now and work on placing the bands all the way to the bottom. This is how the layout will look like after you have placed the vertical double bands. What we are making is actually called the triple double piece because it is 3 bands wide and is made up of double bands. It will help before we place the horizontal bands to push down on the bands. Now we will place horizontal bands on each row of pins, and we will be placing double looped bands. We will skip the top pins and we will start with the second from the top. To make a double loop band, you stretch out a band so it will become more manageable. You twist it and then you fold it to itself, forming a double loop, and then you place that on the pins. Let's do that one more time. You stretch out a band, you twist it into a figure 8, and then fold it, and it forms a double loop, and you place that on the pins. Another method that might be easier for you would be to stretch out a single band and then place it on the pins in a row, and then on one end of the band you twist it and then you loop it back to the pins, forming the double loop. Let's do that again. You stretch out a band and then you place it on the pins in a row. On one end you twist the band and then loop it back to the pins. Now place horizontal bands on all the rows except for the bottom row. You may want to pause the video now and finish placing your horizontal bands. So this is now the finished layout after we have placed the horizontal bands, skipping the top pins and the bottom pins. Now for the bottom pins, we will be placing horizontal bands in a different way. We will use double bands for that, and our first pair goes from the left pin to the center pin. And then our next pair of bands goes from the center pin to the right pin. Then we will cap these bands on the bottom corner, the bottom right corner, with a single band that will be wrapped 4 times on this pin. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we are now ready to loop the bands. You can use the original hook that came with your Rainbow Loom kit, but for projects like this with thicker layers of bands, I prefer to use metal crochet hooks. I use the size G, which is also 4 mm, or you can use the size F. We start looping from the bottom corner pin, and our first band to loop would be this band over here, the horizontal band. We go into the cap band, we grab this pair of double bands, we get it out of the pin, and then loop it onto the center pin. And then we work on these bands, go into the loop, get them out of the pin, and then loop to the forward pin. Now we will work on this vertical band. We go into the loop, get the bands out, and then loop to the forward pin. Let's do that for the center bands, and then let's do that for the left bands. And that is how the bottom bands are looped for this project. Now we will continue looping all the way to the top. When you're done looping the bands, this is how the layout will look like. Now we will need to secure the top loops so we could pull the piece off the loom and prepare the other pieces. And to do that, we will be using C-clips because they will secure our loops better and our piece will not be undone. Please pay attention to how we will secure the loops on this piece. I call this first piece post number 1. We will start with this top right corner, and we will secure it with a C-clip, making sure that all the bands get into the clip. And then for this center loops, we will be securing them with a C-clip, but sometimes it's hard to access the bands, so we can get the bands off the loom and then secure with a C-clip. And then just put them back. Now for the top left loops, we will first place an additional loop of double bands before we secure with a C-clip. So we insert our hook into these bands that are already in place, and then we grab our double bands and then we get them into those loops. Okay, so we form a new set of loops on the top left pin. And those are the loops that we will secure with the C-clip. Now we are ready to pull this entire piece of the loom. An easy way would be to get all the top loops onto the hook and then pull the entire piece of the loom. And like I said, this is what I call post number 1. Stretch the bands out a bit to get them into place. Our next step now is to make a beam that is 2 bands wide, and that beam will connect post number 1 and post number 2, which we will place here. So let us make that beam. We will be making a piece that is 2 bands wide. So let us place our first double bands on the top pins, on the right and on the center. And then we will continue placing double bands all the way to the bottom of the loom. You may want to pause the video now and finish placing your double bands all the way to the bottom of the loom. This is the layout for our double bands for the beam. It is 2 bands wide, and we have placed the bands from the top all the way to the bottom of the loom. We will now place the horizontal bands that will hold this piece together, and we will be using double looped bands. Take note that you will not place a horizontal band on the top pins, and you will also skip the bottom pins. So let's start placing our double loop bands on the second from the top row of pins. You just place it on the pins, and then on one end twist and then loop it back. You may want to pause the video now and continue placing your double loop bands all the way to the second from the bottom row. This is now the resulting layout after we have placed the double looped horizontal bands, and we skip the top pins and the bottom pins. Now before we loop the bands for this piece for the beam, we first need to attach post number 1 to these pins over here. And to do that, we will attach the third loop from the top. 1, 2, 3. This is the third loop. We will attach this third loop to this pin, and we will attach this fourth loop to this pin on the center. You stretch out the bands a bit, and then you get them into the pin. Okay, and make sure that the horizontal band is also placed on the pin. Let's work on the fourth loop. Just stretch it out a bit and then place it on the pin. making sure that the horizontal band is also placed on the pin. Now we will loop the bands for the beam. We start with these double bands. We go into the loops on the bottom, grab the double bands that we want to loop, get them out of the pin, and then loop on the forward pin. Now let us work on these double bands. Go into the loops in the bottom, pull out the bands that you want to loop, and then loop them on the forward pin. Now for the rest of the bands, we will go from the bottom going to the top, looping each of them. You can now pause the video and continue looping the bands all the way to the top. This is how the layout will look like after you have looped the bands for the beam. Post number 1 has been added to the bottom pins, and we loop the bands all the way to the top pins. And like we did with post number 1, we will be securing the top loops for the beam with C-clips, making sure that all the bands get into the C-clip. For the center band, if you find it hard to access the bands, you could get the bands off the loom and then secure with a C-clip. Just make sure all the bands get into the C-clip. Okay, now we grab those top loops and then pull the beam piece off the loom. So this is now post number 1 with the beam attached to it. We will make post number 2 in almost exactly the same way as we made post number 1. We start by placing double bands on each row from the top all the way to the bottom. You may want to pause the video now and continue placing your vertical double bands all the way to the bottom of the loom. So this is the layout for post number 2. Vertical double bands have been placed from the top all the way to the bottom. Now, just like with post number 1, we will be placing our horizontal bands to hold post number 2 together. And I have just pushed down on the bands so that we could place our horizontal bands. And we will place double loop bands on our rows. We skipped the top row, and we will also skip the bottom row for this step. So you may want to pause the video now and finish placing your horizontal bands on the loom. Now for the bottom pins, we will be placing horizontal bands, but this time we will be using double bands, and we placed the first pair from the left pin to the center pin, and then the second pair is placed on the center pin and on the right pin. And then we cap the corner bands with a single band looped 4 times on the pin. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now before we loop the bands for post number 2, we first have to attach the beam to this section of the post. And to do that, we will grab the loops on the beam, and we will attach the first one to this pin, which is second from the top, and the next one to this pin, which is third from the top. So we grab our loops with a hook, with the C-clip still in place just to make sure that they don't get undone. Stretch the bands out a bit and then place them on the pin. You can keep the C-clip in there for now just as a backup, so even if the piece slips off, your bands are still secured. So let's go for the next loops. Just insert the hook into them, stretch them out a bit, and then place them on the pin. So our beam is now attached to our post number 2. And with that, we will be ready to loop the bands. We start with this corner bands, and we are grabbing these double bands, and then we loop them to the center pin. Now we're working on these bands. We go and grab them, get them out of the pin, and then loop to the left pin. Now we will loop these vertical bands. Now from this point, we will be looping the bands forward, moving towards the top. And just keep on doing that until you get to this portion over here. Pause the video right now and work on looping the bands up to here, just before the section where the beam is attached. And when you press play again, I will be showing you how to loop the bands in this section. When we get to this section, the looping is still the same. We just have to work through the heavier layers of bands where the beams are attached. Let's work on that section. Just grab the bands and loop them onto this pin, and then we are grabbing these bands in the bottom for the next one. Just go into the heavy layers of bands, pull out the bands you want to loop, and loop them to their forward pin. Now the same goes for this section over here. We are looking for this pair of bands. This is the one in the bottom. So go into the bands on the top and then pull out the double bands in the bottom, get them out of the pin, and loop to the forward pin. Okay, and we will loop the remaining bands like we did the first ones. So this is now the resulting layout after we have looped the bands for post number 2. And we are now ready to secure the top loops. So we could pull this piece off the loom. Again, we will be using C-clips to secure the top loops for post number 2. We will be doing the same thing that we did with post number 1, but we will be going in the opposite direction. We will start from the left, going to the right. We will first secure the top left loops with a C-clip, making sure all the bands get into the C-clip. Okay. And then for the center loops, if you can't access them with the C-clip, you could get the bands off the loom, or at least stretch them at the top, and then get the C-clip in place. And then just put them back. You need to make sure that all the bands are in the C-clip. Now for the top right loops, we first need to place an additional loop of double bands. So we get our hook into the top right loops and then get our double bands into those loops. And this will form a new set of loops on the top right, and those are the loops that we will secure with a C-clip. Okay, so just like post number 1, we have an additional loop on top of the piece. So with that, our loops are secured for post number 2. We grab all those top loops. You could do this. Grab all the top loops and then pull the entire piece off the loom. You could get the hook out of the loops. Remember, they are still secured with the C-clips. Okay, so this is now our 3 pieces, post number 1 and post number 2, attached together with the beam. Let us now work on the roof for the stable. Again, we will be making a triple double piece. We will place a vertical double bands on all the rows on the loom, starting from the top and then going towards the bottom. Pause the video now and continue placing the bands until you get to the bottom of the loom. So this is now the layout with the vertical bands in place. They are double bands, and this is for the roof. This is actually 1/2 of the roof because we would like to make an extended piece. So we're working on the first half of the loop. We will now place the horizontal bands that will hold the piece together. This is now the bottom part of the loom, and starting with these loops on the outer edge of our piece, I take the C-clip off just from one side of the loops, and then I place the free end on my row. Then I grab the other end with the C-clip and then place them on the other two pins. So this is how it looks like. See, one end of the bands are on this pin and the other end are on these two pins. And I still kept the C clip in there just to keep things secure. Now we are working on these loops. So again, I take the C clip off just one side, and you have to make sure that you're taking off the C clip on the same side so your pieces will not be twisty. Just get the C clip off. Okay, and then on the free ends of the band, this is where you attach to the pin. And then the end with the C-clip, you attach to the two other pins. Okay? And now we have just one more end loop or end loops. Take the C-clip off on one side from the same side as where you took the clips on the first ones, and then place those loops on the pin, and then the ends with the C-clip you place on the other two pins. So what happened here is that the end loops for post number 2 became our horizontal bands for this piece. Okay. Now we will turn the loom around again and place horizontal bands on the remaining rows. And this time, take note that we are placing single bands. Remember that for the post we use double loop bands. For the roof, we will only be using single bands. And that's just simply placing a band on the pins in a row. Okay, so that's it. We have placed our horizontal bands. We skipped the top pins. Starting from the second from the top, we place our horizontal bands all the way up to where we don't have our post attached. And on the bottom pins, again we get double bands, and we place that pair on the left pin and the center pin, and then we get another double bands and we place them on the center pin and on the right pin, and then we cap this corner bands with a single band wrapped 4 times. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just before looping the bands, let me show you our resulting layout. We have placed our vertical bands. We have placed our horizontal bands. They're single bands. And on these 3 pins, in the bottom of the loom, we have attached the end loops of post number 2. And we are now ready to loop our bands. We start looping our bands again from the bottom, and we're working on this pair of bands for starters. We go into the cap band, and then we get the bands that we want to loop out of the pin and then onto the pin on the center. And then we grab the next pair of bands, get them out of the pin, and then onto the left pin. So that is our bottom bands for this piece. And then we loop the next bands forward. Okay. If the bands slip off this way, you could just loop them to the forward pin and then pull back on the band that slipped off and put it back. I think I looped an extra band. This actually belongs here. There you go. Okay. So those are the bottom bands. We have looped them. And now let me show you how to loop in this section where the post number 2 is attached. Let's go to this one side. Just move the piece out of the way. And let us loop these bands. Nothing different about looping them. We're still looping them to their forward pins. We are just working alongside post number 2. You could probably loop up to this. Okay, and then working on the other side, we just move the pieces out of the way again and then work on these bands. So we simply loop them again to the forward pins. Okay, so now we have looped past the attachment point, and the looping will be simpler. All we need to do now is to loop all the way to the top of the loom. You may want to pause the video now and continue looping your bands until you get to the top. So this is how it will look like after you're done looping the bands all the way to the top of the loom. It's just like how we did posts numbers 1 and 2. The only difference is that we now have the posts attached to the piece. Okay, compare your work with the one on the screen and make sure you have looped all the bands. Now we will pull this first part of the roof off the loom, so we need to secure the top loops. You can keep on using C-clips, but toothpicks will be sufficient for this purpose. Just insert toothpicks into each of the loops, and then get the loops off the pins, and they'll be resting on the toothpicks. Okay, and just grab the toothpicks together and then pull. Make sure they don't get undone. Make sure they stay in the middle of the toothpick. Just pull the piece off the loom. Make sure the toothpicks are in place. Okay. So this is now the first half of the roof. Post number 2 is attached. And we will now work on the other half of the roof. To make the other half of the roof, we are making another triple double piece. For those of you who are wondering how many bands I have used so far, I'm not sure. I have not really counted or calculated, but I'm almost done with an entire pack of caramel colored bands. So that gives you an idea of how many bands you need for this project. So let us make that triple double piece again. Again, start with laying down your bands, double bands, on every row of the loom. So pause the video and work on placing those bands. Now you have placed the vertical bands on every row on the loom. And now let us attach the ends of the first part of the roof to this piece. And we will attach it on the bottom of the loom. So you will want to push down on the bands to make room for the other bands that we are placing. Now when you attach the first part of the roof to this second part that we just laid out, make sure that you attach it this way. So it attaches this way and not this way, because it will get all twisty. So make sure that the posts are on this side facing you and the end loops will be attached to these pins. Okay, so place the end loops on their corresponding pins. Okay, so now we will place the horizontal bands that will hold the roof piece together. And we will be using single bands, and we will skip the first 4 rows of pins. 1, 2, 3, 4. We will not be placing horizontal bands on those. We will start on the 5th row of pins. And we will continue placing single bands until we get to the bottom of the layout. Up to here. Okay, now let us start looping the bands. Start with these bands. And then the bands on the center and the bands on the left side. Okay, let's continue looping. And we will only loop up to here, where we have our horizontal band. Okay. And now, very carefully, pull the piece off the loom at least up to around here. Okay, so you could stop there. That's just so we can now attach post number 1 to this section. And like we did with post number 2, the end loops of post number 1 will become the horizontal bands for this section. Let's do it one loop at a time. And we are working on this side, starting from this side. Make sure that it doesn't get all twisty. This is where they will rest. Okay, let me show that to you from different sides. Yeah, this is where they will rest, and we will start by taking the C-clip off this side and then place it on the pin. Okay, and then with the end that still has the C-clip, we place it on the 2 other pins. Now let us work on the next loops. Get the C-clip off on one side of the loop and then place that on the pin. And then the side that still has the C-clip, you place on the other 2 pins. Okay, and then the last loop, get the C or the band off the C-clip, one end of it. Okay, and then the other end you place on the 2 other pins. So post number 1, just like we did with post number 2, is now attached to the roof piece, and the end loops for post number 1 have become the horizontal bands for the roof piece. So let us now continue our looping. You just need to get this piece out of the way of your looping. Let's start with this side. Just do the usual looping to the forward pin. And we will loop only up to this pin, at least for now. Okay, and then we move the pieces out of the way so we could loop on this side. Only up to this pin. Then the left side, loop the bands to the forward pins. Okay, only up to here. Now there was something I forgot to do when I was laying out the bands for this piece. I forgot to place the horizontal bands from the left pin to the center and the center pin to the right. That was to hold the end of the roof piece together. So now we have to place those bands, but the challenge here is that they need to be below these end loops. So we need to get these loops out of the way so we could place our end bands. So to do that, just get these pieces off the pins for now. Okay. And then place the bands, the double bands, from the left to the center, and then from the center to the right. Okay, and then the bands that you took off, just return them to their pins. And we have just fixed a problem I created. I would have redone this entire thing, but I'm too far into the process that I just did a workaround. You should have, and we should have, placed these bands first. Now that we've fixed that situation, let us now loop the bands to their forward pins. And then the top bands, we start with this corner, we loop it to the center pin, and then we loop the next bands to the left pin. Now we secure this entire piece with a single band. Just get the hook into the end loops, get a single band into those loops. Okay, tie a knot, and that will hold the piece together. Don't pull on it too much, and you are now ready to pull the rest of the piece off the loom. Okay. Just stretch out the pieces so they will fall into place. Okay, fold the roof piece halfway, and then this is now the stable. You still have the C-clips in place. You don't need them now, so just very carefully just take the C-clips off. I have taken off the C-clips from the piece, and now we just have to stretch the pieces. Stretch out the pieces, and then this end piece you could tuck it in so it doesn't show. Okay. Now to make the stable stand up, I use foam. This is just a scrap piece of foam that I got from earlier projects, And then I use skewers, fine skewers. You could get this from grocery stores. And I cut my skewers at different lengths. One is shorter, it only goes up to this section of the stable and just enough to get it into the foam piece. So however thick your foam is, that is how long this point or this end will be. But the other skewer, I did not cut. I got it this way. I think this is 6 inches. I I keep that length because I have my extra end here for getting into the foam. But this end on the top, this is where the angel will be attached to. So I just keep this length of the skewer as is. So what we do to reinforce our stable is to grab these top ends of the bands. They're hidden in the loop, so you have to get them out. I want to use this top ends of the bands. Probably 3 of them spaced out so they will support the stable. That's 1, 2, and then a third one will be probably at this point over here. See? I want to grab these top of the bands, the top ends of the bands. Okay, so here's my shorter skewer. I first insert it into this loop in the bottom, and then I insert it into the top end of this band over here, and then the top end, and then lastly these top ends over here. Okay, so there goes my first skewer. And now for the second skewer, we'll do the same thing. We will be taking out the top ends of the bands that are hidden in the loops. There's 1. Okay. There's 2. There's 3. Okay. So again, we go into this bottom loop first, and then on this end piece of the band, this one. Okay. And then, oops, it's hiding. Take it out again. There you go. There you go. And then we get this out the top. Be very careful when you're pushing the skewer into position, because sometimes the friction is enough to generate heat to break your band. So be very careful in sliding your skewer or pushing it into position. So there, my skewers are now in place. This is of course the back side of the stable. This is how you position the skewers on the foam and then prop up the stable.
And that is our stable for the Nativity series.